The woman sat in the courtroom in Utah County with a tense expression and eyes that seemed to be trying to avoid everything happening in front of her. In front of her was not an ordinary divorce, not a family dispute that had gone too far, and not a tragedy she could easily explain by saying she was only pulled into someone else's plan. She was an estranged wife. She was the mother of 2 small children, and the man the entire trial was talking about was her husband, Matthew Clark Restelli, who had driven from California to Utah because he believed his family could be repaired. In court, the story Kathryn Restelli wanted the world to see was not a story of a trap. It was wrapped in the appearance of a broken marriage, tense phone calls, a woman who wanted to leave her husband, and a family saying they were only protecting themselves. If that was all someone heard, some people might think this was a family tragedy, a separation that turned chaotic, a husband showing up at his mother-in-law's house during a tense moment, an incident that the people inside the home could try to explain through fear, self-defense, or a moment of lost control. But then the details began to come out, and from that moment, the self-defense story this family wanted to build began to crack. On the 12th of July, 2024, Matthew Restelli drove from California to American Fork, Utah. He did not go there to start a fight. According to case records, he believed Kathryn wanted to repair their marriage. He believed his wife and 2 small children would return with him. And because of that belief, he traveled hundreds of miles to his mother-in-law's house. When Matthew arrived, Kathryn told him the door was unlocked. She told him to just go inside. And only minutes later, everything changed in a way that could not be reversed. Matthew did not know that his journey had been tracked. He did not know that a tracking device had been used to monitor his route. He did not know that inside that house, prosecutors said there were people waiting not to welcome him back to his family, but to make him part of a story that had been prepared in advance. After Matthew was no longer alive, Kathryn's family tried to build a different image. They wanted police to believe that Matthew had entered the house on his own, that what happened was self-defense, that the people inside the home were only reacting to a sudden threat. But the scene did not tell that story completely. Investigators questioned the way the knife had been placed in Matthew's hand. They questioned the amount of time before the 911 call was made. And the deeper they dug, the more they saw a different picture, a picture that did not begin at the moment Matthew walked through the door, but began with phone calls, promises, plans, and coordination by the very people who should have let him leave that marriage through the legal process. What you are about to watch is not an ordinary family crime case. This is the story of a wife accused of using the hope of reconciliation to draw her husband to a house in Utah. This is the story of a mother, a brother, and a wife, 3 members of the same family standing at the center of a plan that caused 2 children to lose their father forever. And this is the story of a sentence that seems so simple. The door is unlocked, just go inside. A short sentence, an open door. And behind that door was the truth Matthew Restelli never had the chance to see coming. Every detail you are watching has been verified through investigative records, testimony in court, tracking evidence, indictments, plea agreements, the jury's verdict, and the sentences handed down in Utah. This is a case that shook American Fork, not only because Matthew Restelli was pulled by his wife's own family into a trap disguised as the hope of reunion, but also because of the chilling question behind it. How far can someone go when they want to escape a marriage, but do not choose the path of divorce? If you have never heard this story before, prepare yourself, because what happened in American Fork, Utah, on the 12th of July 2024 will force you to question marriage, manipulation, family loyalty, and the terrifying line between a bitter separation and an unforgivable conspiracy. To understand why Kathryn Restelli eventually had to stand before the court, plead guilty to murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and felony discharge of a firearm, then receive a sentence of at least 6 years to life, we have to go back to before Matthew Restelli set foot inside that house, before the self-defense story was built, before the knife became the detail that made police suspicious, before the tracking device revealed that Matthew's journey had been monitored, and before a father of 2 small children drove to Utah, believing he was going to bring his family home only to become the center of one of the most haunting family conspiracy cases in America in recent years. Matthew Clark Restelli was 42 years old when he drove from California to Utah, believing he was going toward his family. He was a husband, a father of 2 young children, and a man caught in the painful collapse of a marriage. His wife, Kathryn Restelli, had left California and taken their children to American Fork, Utah, where she was staying with her mother, Tracy Grist. At first, the situation looked like a family separation that might still be repaired. Matthew believed there was a chance Kathryn might return with him, but according to prosecutors, that hope was exactly what made him vulnerable. Inside the home in American Fork were 3 people who would later become central to the criminal case: Kathryn Restelli, her mother Tracy Grist, and Kathryn's brother, Kevin Ellis. Kevin would later be identified as the person who directly used the firearm. Kathryn would later admit that she helped bring Matthew to the house. Tracy would later be described by prosecutors as the center of the plan. What began as a broken marriage turned into a case where family members were accused of creating a trap and then trying to explain it as self-defense. In the weeks before Matthew died, Kathryn had left California with the children. Matthew wanted his family back, or at least wanted to believe that a return was possible. Kathryn later admitted that she led him to believe she was open to reconciliation. She made him think he could come to Utah, pick her up, and bring her and the children back to California. That belief became the bridge that brought Matthew hundreds of miles from home to the house where he would never leave alive. The planning did not depend only on words. According to court records and Kathryn's later statements, a tracking device was placed in Matthew's vehicle. As he drove from California toward Utah, his movement could be followed. Kathryn also stayed in contact with him during the trip. Prosecutors said she kept him calm, kept him moving, and kept him from realizing what was waiting for him. The drive that Matthew believed was a step toward repairing his family was, according to the state, being monitored by the people preparing for his arrival. The plan prosecutors later described had a specific shape. Matthew was supposed to enter the house in a way that could later be made to look suspicious. Kathryn told him the door was unlocked and that he could come inside when he arrived. The state argued that this instruction was not innocent, it was part of a setup. If Matthew walked in without someone opening the door for him, the family could later claim he had entered without permission. That would support the story they wanted to tell, that Kevin had only reacted to a threat inside the home. Before Matthew arrived, prosecutors said the house was prepared. Items were moved. The front area of the home was arranged in a way that would matter later. Kathryn later testified that toys were moved and blankets were placed over furniture. The state argued that these were not normal household actions, but steps taken before a planned confrontation. In a case built on small details, the ordinary objects inside the home became part of the evidence. On the 12th of July, 2024, Matthew continued the long drive to American Fork. He was coming from California, carrying the belief that he might be able to reunite with his wife and children. Kathryn had told him to come in because the door would be open. The children were inside the home. Kathryn was upstairs. Tracy Grist and Kevin Ellis were also there. In the prosecution's version of events, everyone in the house had a role, even if each role was different. Matthew arrived at the house late that night. Reports placed his arrival around 10:15 p.m. He came to the door and entered the home. What he did not know, according to prosecutors, was that his entrance was exactly what the plan required. He was not walking into a private argument or a simple family confrontation. He was walking into a home where the people inside had already discussed how his death would be explained. Only minutes after Matthew entered, Kevin Ellis fired multiple rounds. Matthew was struck inside the home and died there. Court reporting later said he was shot 7 times. For the script, the important fact is not to linger on the injuries, but to understand what the number showed in court. This was not treated as a single startled reaction. Prosecutors argued that the evidence did not match the story of a simple self-defense moment. Immediately after the shooting, the first emergency call did not come from Tracy Grist inside the home. The first 911 call came from a neighbor who heard the gunfire. That detail became important. According to trial reporting, the neighbor called within about a minute after hearing the shots. Tracy Grist called later from inside the house, several minutes after that first outside call. Prosecutors would later argue that the delay mattered because it gave the people inside time to shape the scene before fully involving police. When Tracy did call 911, the story from inside the house was that Matthew had entered with a knife and that Kevin had fired in self-defense. That explanation was simple, but the scene was not. American Fork officers arrived and found Matthew inside the home. Kevin was there. Tracy was there. Kathryn and the children were upstairs. Officers separated people, secured the area, and began treating the home as a scene that needed careful investigation. At first, Kevin maintained that he had acted to protect himself or others. His lawyer later repeated the same general position. Matthew had entered without permission. Matthew had a knife, and Kevin responded because he believed there was danger. But investigators quickly saw details that did not sit right. The knife was one of the first problems. It was found in Matthew's right hand, even though Matthew was left-handed. Its position looked unnatural to investigators. The way it was held did not appear consistent with someone actively using it in an attack. There were other concerns. Matthew had been struck in the right wrist, the same hand where the knife was found. That raised questions about whether he could have been holding the knife the way the scene suggested. Later reporting also noted that DNA testing on the knife did not identify DNA from Matthew, Kathryn, Kevin, or Tracy. The knife, which was supposed to support the self-defense story, became one of the pieces of evidence that made that story weaker. The timing of the 911 calls also drew attention. If Kevin had truly responded to an immediate threat, investigators wanted to know why a neighbor called first, and why Tracy's call from inside the home came later. Prosecutors argued that the minutes before Tracy's call were used to make the scene look like self-defense. They pointed to the knife, the delay, the statements, and the setup before Matthew entered the house. The investigation expanded beyond the living room. Detectives examined phones, messages, search history, and tracking data. They reviewed communications between Kathryn, Tracy, and Kevin. They looked at how Matthew had been drawn to Utah and how his trip had been monitored. The tracking device became a major piece of the case because it suggested that Matthew's arrival was not a surprise. The family was not shocked by his appearance. According to prosecutors, they knew where he was and when he was getting close. Detectives also looked at Kathryn's role. She had been the person Matthew trusted most in that moment because he believed she might come home with him. Later, Kathryn admitted she helped create that belief. She said she made him think reconciliation was possible. She told him the door was unlocked. She kept him calm during the drive. Those admissions were powerful because they turned the case from a disputed shooting into an alleged plan built around deception. Kevin Ellis was charged first because he was the person who directly fired the weapon. He continued to rely on the self-defense explanation, but the state moved forward with murder and related charges. At that early stage, Kathryn and Tracy were not immediately arrested. Investigators continued working through the evidence for months. That slower timeline would later become important because the case against Kathryn and Tracy depended heavily on planning, messages, behavior, and what happened before and after the shooting. By late October 2024, the investigation had gone far beyond Kevin. Kathryn Restelli and Tracy Grist were arrested after authorities concluded that Matthew's death was not simply the result of Kevin reacting to an unexpected threat. Prosecutors said Kathryn and Tracy had helped create the circumstances that brought Matthew into the home. The case was then charged as a larger conspiracy, with each person playing a different part. There is no full public interrogation transcript that allows every question and answer to be recreated. That matters for a responsible telling of the case. The public record does not support invented interview scenes. What is known is that Kevin maintained self-defense. Kathryn later accepted a plea agreement and gave statements against her family members, and investigators relied on the physical scene, the delayed 911 call, the knife, the tracking data, phone records, and later testimony to challenge the original story. In July 2025, Kathryn Restelli entered guilty pleas as part of a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to reduced charges that included murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and felony discharge of a firearm. In her plea statement, she admitted that she had helped lure Matthew from California to Utah. She admitted she allowed him to believe she wanted to repair the marriage and return with the children. She admitted she told him the door was unlocked and that he could enter the house. Kathryn's plea also placed her inside the larger plan. She described how Matthew's trip was tracked. She said she knew the plan involved making his entrance look like something that could justify violence. She later testified that she was upstairs when Matthew came inside and that Kevin fired soon afterward. Her admission became a central piece of the prosecution's case against both Kevin and Tracy. On the 9th of September 2025, Kathryn was sentenced. She received 2 sentences of 1 to 15 years for murder and conspiracy, and a sentence of 5 years to life for felony discharge of a firearm. Because of how the judge ordered the sentences to run, her minimum term became about 6 years to life. At sentencing, the judge emphasized that Kathryn had time to stop what was happening, and did not. Her children, he said, were also victims of her choices because their father was gone and their mother was going to prison. Kevin Ellis went to trial in January 2026. By then, Kathryn had already pleaded guilty and became a witness for the state. She testified against her brother, telling the jury that Matthew had been lured to the house and that she had played the part of a wife willing to reconcile. Prosecutors argued that Kevin was not defending himself. They said he was waiting as part of a plan and that the scene was staged afterward to support a false story. Kevin's defense took a more complicated position. The defense did not simply say nothing had been planned by anyone. Instead, they suggested Kevin had been manipulated or used by his mother and sister. They argued he was not part of the conspiracy in the way prosecutors claimed. The jury ultimately reached a split result. Kevin was found guilty of murder, obstruction of justice, domestic violence in the presence of a child, possession of a firearm as a restricted person, and drug possession. But he was found not guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. That verdict meant the jury rejected the self-defense claim, but did not find that prosecutors had proven Kevin's participation in the conspiracy charge beyond a reasonable doubt. Legally, that distinction mattered. Emotionally, the outcome was still severe. Kevin had been convicted of murdering Matthew. On the 31st of March 2026, he was sentenced to 15 years to life for murder, with additional consecutive sentences for other convictions. The judge noted that Kevin had the ability to say no, but did not. The final major trial belonged to Tracy Grist. Her trial took place in April 2026. Prosecutors described her as the center of the plan, the person who directed and shaped what happened. They argued that Kathryn was used to lure Matthew, Kevin was used as the person with the firearm, and Tracy was the one coordinating the larger strategy. The defense rejected that version, arguing that the prosecution had forced the evidence into a dramatic narrative and that Tracy had not planned Matthew's death. Kathryn testified again, this time against her mother. She said her role had been to act like the good wife, to make Matthew believe the family could be restored. She also testified about the children being upstairs and about preparations inside the home. Prosecutors presented the knife, the delayed 911 call, the tracking device, search history, messages, and the physical details at the scene. Tracy testified in her own defense and denied being part of a plan to kill Matthew. After more than 4 hours of deliberation, the jury found Tracy Grist guilty of murder, conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and domestic violence in the presence of a child. The verdict completed the prosecution's case against the person they had described as the central figure. On the 10th of June 2026, Tracy was sentenced. The judge imposed 15 years to life for murder, 1 to 15 years for conspiracy, 1 to 15 years for obstruction, and additional terms for domestic violence in the presence of a child. The sentences were ordered to run consecutively. The judge called Tracy extremely dangerous and said he did not believe she should be released during her lifetime, though parole decisions ultimately belong to the Utah Board of Pardons and Parole. By the end of the case, all 3 central figures had been legally resolved. Kathryn admitted her role and received a prison sentence. Kevin was convicted of murder and received consecutive terms. Tracy was convicted on all counts and received the harshest sentencing language from the court. The original claim of self-defense had collapsed under the weight of the scene, the knife, the delayed call, the tracking data, and the testimony. The Matthew Restelli case remains striking because of the way hope was used against him. He drove from California because he believed he was moving toward his wife and children. Instead, prosecutors said he was being watched, guided, and drawn into a home where a story had already been prepared for after he died. The legal record now tells that story in 3 parts: the wife who lured him, the brother who fired, and the mother who was convicted as the center of the plan. For Matthew's children, the result was permanent. Their father was gone, and the family around them was divided by prison sentences, verdicts, and a plan that ended inside a house in American Fork. The strongest message from the Matthew Restelli case is that trust can be weaponized when a family conflict turns into a plan. Matthew drove from California to Utah believing he was moving toward reconciliation, his wife, and his children. Instead, prosecutors said he was guided into a home where others were waiting, where a story of self-defense had already been prepared, and where the truth was almost hidden behind a staged scene. The lesson is that warning signs inside family disputes must never be ignored when deception, control, weapons, or threats begin to appear. Separation and custody conflict can create fear and anger, but no grievance gives anyone the right to turn another person's hope into a trap. When someone is being isolated, tracked, manipulated, or pulled into a situation that feels controlled by others, those signs matter. This case also shows how small details can expose a larger truth. A delayed 911 call, an unusual knife placement, phone records, tracking data, and testimony broke apart the first explanation. Matthew's children lost their father, and 3 relatives went to prison. The final lesson is clear. Truth may be delayed, but careful investigation can still uncover it, even after calculated silence.